everyone, welcome to the making of Iris. She's from a few years ago. My husband made me a chair, a welded metal chair. She's really just to decorate the chair, I think. There wasn't really any other reason, and the best part was making the freckles. That was great. Her eyes were made the way I used to make eyes, which I still do sometimes, but since have found much better ways. Somebody on YouTube, Virgo's Alchemy, she does amazing eyes, sells wonderful molds. They are perfect, symmetrical, really great. And she also shows how to make the eye parts once you've made a mold. And it's all in resin. I do use crystals sometimes still, and I really like the look of the crystals as well. But, you know, sometimes you can't really improve on perfection, and her way is just, well, I think perfection. But these ones were made with my crystal method. I also chose a very light clay so that she could have very pale skin, and obviously the freckles and moles. I really enjoy doing that. Her face, I can't remember who she was based on. I think I always use reference for the face. When I'm not doing a portrait, I don't try to make her look like anybody, but I do always use a real life facial reference because I just think it's really important. Well, for me it is anyway. I have done a few things where I haven't, and it can be kind of fun to just not have a reference at all and just go from memory. Maybe one day I'll just do that for fun, but when I'm working on a figure, I always use some kind of real life reference photographs. As always, I used my Genesis heat set paints to paint her. I always use Genesis heat set paints. They are the best when it comes to working with polymer clay. I personally find that acrylic paints can be sticky on the clay. I don't know why. They just never seem to set really well. I guess maybe if you use some kind of a varnish over the top, but I wouldn't even know if that would work for polymer clay. I've never used that myself, and I wonder if it would react with the clay. I don't know. Polymer clay can be quite temperamental and react with a lot of things, but Genesis heat set paints work brilliantly. So they don't set until you've dried them, usually with an embossing gun just to set them, but you do need to bake them in the oven as well to really get the best out of them. Once you bake them in the oven, they really kind of set into the clay, and it doesn't look like they're sitting on the surface anymore. It really looks like they're part of the clay, and they become very matte. For the hands, always use an armature for the hands because I always like to make sure that the fingers are strong, so I use a wire armature. I also find, I'm so used to using a wire armature, I actually don't even know how to sculpt without one. I think I'd find that very, very difficult. I find the armature gives you a nice base to work on top of. I usually do one layer of clay on the hands, a thin layer of clay on the hands just to cover them, bake that so that you've got something quite solid to then work on your second layer of clay over the top. And then I just build each finger up, adding small pieces of clay slowly so that you don't ever really get more than you need. Sometimes you do have to scrape a bit back, but as a general rule I try to add rather than take away most of the time. And then I use my brush and mineral spirit, but not a lot of mineral spirit because mineral spirit will dissolve the clay. So I dip my brush in the spirits, wipe it right off on a tissue so that all that's left is just a residue of mineral spirits, and that seems to be more than enough. This was a few years ago, so I was still sculpting the feet separately. I've changed that now. I don't sculpt the feet separately anymore because I find that you kind of need the next part of your body to kind of relate to the part you're working on, if that makes sense. So if you sculpt something separately when it's not actually on the body, the scale can go off, the anatomy can go off, because even though it might look great as it is as a separate piece, putting it back on the body, you kind of need each part to relate to each other and you need them to work together. So when I'm sculpting the foot, I sort of needed to work with the leg, so I like to now sculpt the foot on the leg so that I can see where the ankle joins the foot, and then where the ankle joins the leg, and the leg joins the knee, and kind of work all together like that. So I also like to work on the whole body together, so I don't just sculpt one area and sort of refine it and then work on the next. I try to work on all parts together so that they all kind of relate to each other and become one together, if that makes sense. At this point I was still using the armature where you can take the legs off. Now that can be really helpful if you have a pose that is really complicated and it's got sort of bent in on itself and it's really hard to get into all the nooks and crannies. Then having legs that can be removed until the last minute is a very good thing. So the legs are built on a rod which slots into a tube on the armature, and so you can remove the legs. That's what I've been doing on this one, although I found that once I had done that, this is why I have sort of changed now, and I've gone back to sort of using an armature that's basically all together, because I would often find that I would work on the legs and then I would put them back on the body and they would be wrong. There'd be something not right about them, and then end up wanting to just work on the legs on the body, which again is like working each part kind of relating to each other, and if you start to try and do them separately, it can just go off and not look so good, and then you end up having to redo it anyway, scrape it down and redo it. The times like when you have a very complicated pose that might be sort of bent in on itself, then I really think that having those separate limbs can be good, because even if it's not quite right, you've built up quite a lot of the mass, and then if you put it back on the body, you slide them back into the armature, there's a lot of mass already there, then you can work on top of that, so it's not like starting from scratch. So with this one, I did find that because the chair was right kind of in the way of sculpting her back, especially when she was on the stand, so I was sort of fighting with holding her on the stand, which is very helpful because then you don't have to try and hold the figure while the clay is all raw and can get squashed. But at the same time, I couldn't get to the back of her because I had the chair in the way, so because I was sculpting her on the chair so that it would sort of fit, she would fit nicely on the chair. So eventually I got to a point where I just could not carry on without figuring something out so that I could get to her back. So what I ended up doing is finding a glass jar that I had that was kind of the same height as the chair, and then ended up just putting her on that and then fastened her back onto the sculpting stand. Then I could carry on sculpting her back quite easily. I do try to get as much of the body sculpted in one go as possible, and with this one I really pretty much did the whole thing all in one, because if you've got everything still raw, you can adjust the pose. I find it, I don't know if anyone else does, but I find it really difficult to try and imagine a pose when all you've got is an armature or perhaps the first layer. Because what I usually do is I will bend the armature first, and then I put a layer of clay onto the armature and bake that, and it's sort of my underneath clay, because for one thing you don't want such a thick layer of clay at the end when you've sculpted the figure that it takes a long time to cure, because in the oven, bake in the oven, because you could end up sort of maybe not baking it as thoroughly as it should be, because it's so thick and it takes so long to bake. It's probably better, or what I find is better, to have a layer of clay underneath that has been baked very nicely, very solidly, and then build on top of that with another layer of raw clay on top. The good parts as well about that, apart from the baking, is that you've now got something that's more solid, more of a mass to be able to kind of work with and get your pose, and then also it's a solid base to work on top of with your new clay. The only thing is, even then, even when you have an underneath and you've kind of got a basic shape of what you want, it's still really hard to get that pose perfect. I mean, I don't think I've ever managed that. I always end up changing the pose quite a few times. As much of the outside, the final clay on top that can stay raw, the better. So in this case, I pretty much sculpted this all together. I'd forgotten about this one. Having said that, I got to a point which usually happens in most of my sculptures where I cannot carry on anymore with everything being raw, because at some point you're going to have to try to be able to hold onto the figure, and you need the clay that you're holding onto to be solid so that it doesn't get squashed while you're holding onto it. So it's usually when you get down to the legs. In this case it was the legs that got to a point where I had to bake. So it will have been the first bake. For the first bake, I usually bake about 40 minutes. And that's really just to get it to a point where the clay is solid. It won't crack, it won't break under your pressure. It's not fully baked. Still soft enough, is that the right word? It's still not solid enough. If you had to scrape into it, you could without breaking your knife, because when it's fully baked it's hard to scrape into it. But sometimes you want to be able to whittle away some if you kind of starting to build on with more clay somewhere else, and you find that maybe this part that you've sculpted is not quite right, you want to scrape away. It's nice for that clay to still be a little bit soft. It's sort of like soap almost when it's baked but not fully baked. So sort of 40 minutes is about the right time, I find. So I baked the top half, then I had to go back and build the legs after that. Sometimes at that point you might find that the hips are maybe not quite right from what you want to do, so you have to maybe scrape them down a bit and add the new clay. So that's what I did. Then when she was finally fully baked, when it's the final bake, you want to bake her for an hour. Well, I do. I bake for an hour. to make sure that everything is fully cured, that nothing is left soft or not quite right. Once I had got the body done and I'd painted it, I wanted to make a costume for her to sit in, leotard. I tried with fabric first, and that was an absolute fail because I used a velvet fabric, which of course on us looks quite fine. It was a lovely silk velvet, it was lovely, but on a small scale figure it looks very chunky, so it just did not work. And I do find often I end up going back to clay even when I start out at fabric. I would love to do more fabric clothing, but I often find that fabric just doesn't work on such a small figure. When you're using clay fabric, you can mold it to look heavy. You can never make real fabric look heavy. I mean, you can use fabric stiffener and that can be quite good, but in some cases like a leotard, it might work, but I still think maybe clay is just going to be that much better. So I ended up choosing to use clay. I had to scrape off all of what I'd done because I'd glued this fabric on and it just didn't look right, so I pulled it all off, started all over again, which of course don't ever be scared to do that, because at the end of the day, if something doesn't look right, every time you look at that figure you're going to remember that you should have changed it. It's just far better to just go ahead and do it. I took off the fabric and gave her a clay leotard, and then once everything is done, once the paintwork is done, all of the clothing clay fabric has been put on, then I put my figures back in the oven and then I bake them for the last time, and that time is the full bake. And what you've baked before cannot be counted, so you can't take, if you've baked them for 40 minutes before, you don't add that to your baking time. That is, past. You have to start all over again. And I put them in the oven again for an hour, because that way I know that everything that I've sculpted, all the raw clay, is baked fully. Even sometimes if clay is very thin, I still bake it for an hour, because once it's baked for an hour, it is really super strong. If you've used a good clay like FIMO or CERNIT, then the final result is super strong and even a little bit bendable. Not a lot, but maybe just a little bit. For example, the roses that I made with the petals, they were all baked for an hour. Once I'd baked them for an hour, I know that those roses are really strong and they're not going to break easily, and same with the petals. I ended up painting the chair. I used a spray paint, matte black for it, and painted the wood on the seat just with an acrylic and varnish. And for her hair, I used Surrey alpaca, which is a beautifully soft hair, which is really lovely for very small figures. It's very fine and it's soft, very beautiful. It suits the scale of the figure. Sometimes if the fibre is too thick, it can look very out of scale, really. Surrey alpaca is one of the nicest ones, and viscose. Thank you for watching, and thank you to all my patrons on Patreon for supporting me. I really appreciate every one of you. If you'd like to join me on Patreon, I'd be so happy to welcome you into my studio. I'm currently uploading 1 hour of sculpting tutorials each month. At the moment, we're making the salty mermaid in a cup. The next episode is coming out on the 30th. If you join, you'll also gain access to over 250 videos I've already posted, which include hours of real-time tutorial footage. For example, I document the entire process of sculpting a man, a smiling face, and a child. You can also sign up for my mailing list for free by clicking on the link in the video description. Everyone who signs up gets a free in-depth sculpting a nose tutorial. So thank you so much for watching. Subscribe and click on the notification bell so you don't miss the next video. Thank you. See you again soon.